Welcome back again. Please comment down below what time it is right now wherever you are, and like the video. It's very important for the algorithm. Thank you. Let's get to it. On January 15, 1947, a mother walking with her child in Los Angeles spotted what she thought was a broken mannequin in an empty lot. But it wasn't plastic. It was the severed body of 22-year-old Elizabeth Short, posed in a way that still shocks investigators today. Who could have carried out such a calculated and grotesque crime, and why leave her displayed for anyone to find? Tonight, we begin with that haunting discovery, tracing how the Black Dahlia became one of America's most enduring mysteries. On the morning of January 15th, 1947, a woman named Betty Bersinger was walking along Norton Avenue in Los Angeles with her young daughter. It was an ordinary routine, just a quiet stroll in the neighborhood, when she noticed something unusual in the vacant lot across the street. What caught her eye first was the pale figure lying in the grass. At a glance, she assumed it was a store mannequin broken in half and discarded, something left behind by someone careless. In the daylight, the figure's white appearance gave the sense of plastic or porcelain, but taking a closer look, the horror of what she had seen began to settle in. This was no mannequin. It was a woman's body, cut in two, left exposed for anyone passing by to see. The sight stopped her in shock. She gathered herself and hurried away, her daughter still with her, moving quickly to call the police. That phone call would set in motion one of the most infamous investigations in Los Angeles history. Within a short time, officers arrived at the location along the sidewalk of Norton Avenue. What they found would raise questions not just for them, but for the city at large. The body was positioned deliberately, separated cleanly into two sections, the torso and the legs lower down in the grass. Elizabeth Short, although not yet identified at the time, was lying there fully exposed, and for the detectives first on the scene, the odd composition of the body immediately suggested that someone had intended for it to be discovered. At first, even the police hesitated. The scene was so strange it looked staged. People wondered if decomposition could explain the pale, almost wax-like appearance of the skin. Others pointed to the lack of blood around the area as evidence that the crime had taken place elsewhere. Normally, a violent death leaves marks on the ground, blood, signs of struggle. Here, there was nothing. The surface of the grass was clean. For investigators, this absence was as alarming as the mutilation itself. It meant that the body had been washed, drained, and transported after death. Whoever did this had taken time and put thought into arrangement, not simply disposal. Adding to the disturbing nature were the details of how the body was posed. The arms of the victim were lifted and bent in stark angles, and the legs were arranged several inches away from the torso. In one of the most haunting elements, part of her lower organs, including her intestines, had been carefully tucked back underneath her body. That act could not be mistaken for chance. It suggested a form of staging, a deliberate act with meaning only the person responsible would know. Detectives understood that such a presentation was meant to shock, to leave an impression. Witnesses in the area soon gathered. As word spread of the grisly discovery, onlookers tried to make sense of what they saw. Some still whispered that maybe it really was a mannequin, as their minds searched for any explanation other than murder. For an ordinary passerby, the sharp cuts looked so precise that it was hard to imagine this had been done by anyone without skill. The clean division of the body raised immediate speculation among both witnesses and the responding officers. Could this act have been committed by someone with medical training? That question would echo throughout the case for years. Within the hour, the crime scene filled with more officers, detectives, and curious members of the public. Reporters were not far behind, tipped off by the scanner calls of something strange unfolding on Norton Avenue. The area itself was not secluded. The lot was open, visible from the street in broad daylight. Detectives determined that the placement of the corpse had been intentional. The killer had not hidden the body in an alleyway or buried it in a remote field. They had displayed it, laying it out in a space where neighbors, pedestrians, and eventually police could not miss it. For many, that was one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire situation. The killer had turned their crime into a statement. Police, already under pressure to take immediate action, roped off the area and began their first documentation. Photographers recorded the strange sight, while investigators combed the surrounding ground for any clue of how the body arrived. They searched for tire tracks, footprints, scraps of fabric, and anything else disturbed within the soil and weeds. Very little turned up that day. It seemed the killer had chosen the spot carefully. There was no sign of a struggle in the lot itself, reinforcing the theory that Short had been murdered and mutilated elsewhere, and then her remains transported to Norton Avenue. The The precise condition of the body made clear to investigators that this was not simply an act of rage. The cuts were too exact, straight and even, with no jagged tearing. The empty whiteness of the skin showed she had been drained of blood. These details created a strange duality for everyone at the scene. On the one hand, it looked like something out of a medical demonstration, as if a dissection had been performed with professional precision. On the other hand, the posing of the arms and the hidden intestines showed symbolism, theatre, the signature of someone who wanted to disturb, even terrify. Neighbours gave statements and described how they had not noticed anything unusual in the hours leading up to the discovery. No screams, no sounds of struggle, no vehicles remembered stopping at the vacant lot during the night. That deepened the mystery. How had the killer moved a body there in the dark without anyone noticing? And why leave her lying so visibly on private land that faced a public street? Whatever the reasoning, it shocked not just detectives but every person who heard of it. As the day continued, crowds grew around the taped-off field. Curious locals gathered in increasing numbers, staring toward the cordoned grass where uniformed officers tried to keep them back. The police worked against time to remove the remains before the throngs of onlookers and press magnified the chaos. Yet, in doing so, they already faced one devastating factor. The intrusion of outside parties at the scene risked contaminating potential evidence. Reporters walked dangerously close, neighborhood residents recounted their recollections openly, and children whispered nervously on the sidewalks. Even in this earlier stage, control of the crime scene seemed fragile. That afternoon, detectives reached a firm conclusion. This was one of the most horrifying murders Los Angeles had ever faced. The staging of the body, the surgical nature of the cuts, and the chosen location presented a crime that was not only violent but deeply intentional. This was not a murder of passion left behind in panic. It was an act of planning, even performance. The motivation was unknown, but the impact would be undeniable. Overnight, Elizabeth Short's body ceased to be a faceless discovery and became the center of a case that would dominate the city's attention. The broken mannequin was, in fact, the opening chapter of the story remembered as the Black Dahlia murder. From that moment, authorities rushed to interpret not only what had been done, but who was capable of doing it. Within a single day of Elizabeth Short's body being found, the details of the crime were not just whispered across Los Angeles, they were splashed across front pages nationwide. The press moved quickly, rushing reporters to the scene and filling columns with descriptions that emphasized horror over fact. In an era when newspapers fought fiercely for readership, crime stories like this one were not just news, they were commodities. The coverage had a rhythm, fast-moving and dramatic, designed to grab attention before a rival paper got in first. And with the Black Dahlia, they had a story unlike anything else at the time. A young woman murdered in a way that seemed almost too bizarre to be real. Elizabeth Short herself was not known nationally before her death. She had lived a transient life, mostly known to acquaintances, moving in and out of Los Angeles while working occasional jobs. But reporters painted a different picture. In articles, she was cast as a mysterious would-be actress who spent her nights drifting through Hollywood clubs. In truth, records and testimony from friends showed she had not secured acting roles, and her lifestyle reflected something closer to instability than glamour. Yet the need to make the story sell shaped the way she was presented. Readers were not encouraged to ask who she actually was. Instead, they were invited into a neatly crafted image of a dark-haired starlet cut down before her eyes. The nickname itself appeared almost immediately. The Black Dahlia first showed up in headlines, not from her friends or family, but from reporters looking to brand the case with something memorable. There had been a popular film released the previous year, The Blue Dahlia, and the similarity was convenient. Short's preference for dressing in black clothing gave an easy hook to connect. The nickname stuck so quickly that within hours of its first appearance, it was as if she had never been Elizabeth Short at all. In death, her real identity was already being overshadowed by the media creation of the Black Dahlia. That early coverage leaned less on police statements and more on lurid speculation. Papers focused on her drinking, her clothing, and hints at her social life, portraying her as a woman immersed in a nightlife of clubs and men. While police were still trying to figure out the most basic facts, where she had been living, where she had last been seen, some stories filled in blanks with rumor. Editors knew these details captured attention. They presented her not as someone struggling with poverty or uncertainty, but as a figure tied to excess and danger, feeding into stereotypes already attached to Hollywood. This was not only news reporting, it was framing. Elizabeth Short was described in headlines as a temptress, a secretive woman who may have been leading a double life. Almost none of that came from verified facts. Instead, It fit neatly into the post-war appetite for stories about fallen women and the price of ambition. In the late 1940s, American readers consumed crime news at a scale that often turned real lives into serialized dramas. And on this stage, Short became the perfect subject. Young, attractive, tied to Hollywood by proximity, and murdered in a way that demanded further reading. Readers could not look away, and editors knew they had captured a tale that went beyond ordinary homicide. It is worth understanding the climate of journalism at the time. Los Angeles newspapers were not just reporting for accuracy, they were competing against one another for circulation. The Los Angeles Examiner, the Herald Express, and the Los Angeles Times each sought exclusives, often pushing to exaggerate or rush details without proper backing. Front pages cycled new theories daily. Some of the earliest write-ups emphasized gruesome surgical details before official reports were even finalized. Others used suggestive photos of Short, cropped or staged to fit the idea she had been living dangerously. In many cases, those portrayals bore little resemblance to her financial struggles or her habit of drifting between rooming houses. The divide between her reality and her image only widened as the weeks went on. People who knew her personally often described her as shy, sometimes evasive about her plans, and unable to find steady work, but almost no one reading those papers encountered that description. Instead, what they encountered was the shadow figure of the Black Dahlia, mysterious, provocative, and tied to the underworld of Los Angeles nightlife. Once that picture had been painted, it was difficult for the public to see her as anything else. The use of visuals was also important. Photographs of her from earlier years were edited, her hair emphasized in darker tones, her clothing highlighted to capture the noir mood of Hollywood. Her murder was the horror, but her image was what sold the papers. In this way, the press transformed her from a person to a symbol, the embodiment of Los Angeles danger, tucked in between the war years and the rise of Hollywood stardom. Readers consumed her as part of the city's myth, not as a 22-year-old who had written letters to her family apologizing for her instability. And because most readers only knew her through the press, that fictional version became the accepted truth. For journalists, lurid details took precedence because they drew in readers in ways verified reports often did not. It mattered less if information was incomplete. A mysterious nickname, an unnamed witness, or the mere hint that she had been seen with men of influence carried more value on a front page than a factual correction later on. Each paper sought to outdo the next, so restraint disappeared. One outlet emphasized the cuts on her body. Another stretched claims of supposed connections to film studios, while still another suggested unsavory rumors about her lifestyle. This cycle of embellishment amplified the case and spread the legend far beyond California. By highlighting her supposed secrets, the coverage blurred the line between victim and spectacle. Elizabeth Short was no longer presented as a young woman killed brutally, but as a figure in a darker story about Hollywood ambition. The more mysterious and scandalous her portrayal became, the more it seemed to justify the label of the Black Dahlia. That narrative, more than any investigative finding, solidified her place in crime history. In reality, she had been scraping by with limited resources, working as a waitress and relying on temporary arrangements to survive in the city. But to newspaper readers in 1947, she was represented as a doomed femme fatale, a Hollywood beauty destroyed on the edges of fame. The public appetite for such stories was enormous in the late 1940s. After the Second World War, readers looked for distractions, and sensational crime filled that role. Papers encouraged the trend because sales numbers reflected it. Each shocking headline guaranteed higher circulation. The result was predictable. Elizabeth Short's death was not just one story among many. It became a feeding frenzy. Within weeks, articles had shifted attention away from the search for her killer and toward continuous speculation about her lifestyle. What was missed in that exchange was the fuller picture of who she truly was. This transformation turned Elizabeth Short's murder into more than an unsolved crime. It became an enduring story shaped by the press itself. While detectives were trying to collect timelines and autopsy findings, newspaper covers had already written their conclusion about who the Black Dahlia had been. That divide between narrative and reality mattered because it complicated the police effort from the start. Investigators not only had to chase facts, they also had to battle myths that were being printed daily. As weeks passed, the lines blurred so far that separating truth from invention was almost impossible. That was the environment detectives walked into as they tried to solve the murder of Elizabeth Short. Who was Elizabeth Short in the days leading up to her death? That question became central to investigators almost immediately after her body was identified. To understand what may have happened, police tried to reconstruct her daily movements. Yet what they found was not a simple, consistent story. Instead, her final days exposed a life marked by instability and secrecy, the kind of drifting existence that made her vulnerable in a city as sprawling and indifferent as Los Angeles in the mid-1940s. She lived mostly in rooming houses, moving frequently from one location to another, and often relied on acquaintances for short stays when money ran dry. At times, she worked as a waitress, but steady income often slipped away. Her life in those last weeks showed resilience, but also patterns of uncertainty, the kind that made it easy to lose track of where she was or who she was with. Friends described her as charming but secretive, someone who kept her movements close. When asked where she was headed, she often provided unclear answers, or none at all. That repeated pattern created frustration among acquaintances and left police with scattered reports that often conflicted. She cultivated social connections but guarded her real situation, perhaps to maintain an image, or to avoid admitting how unstable her circumstances had become. This secrecy, chosen or not, became critical when detectives tried to retrace her steps after January 9th. That date marked the last confirmed sighting of her while alive. She had been seen with a man named Robert "Red" Manley, a married salesman from Los Angeles. Manley had met her weeks earlier and had been providing her transportation. On January 9th, he dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel downtown. Witnesses there confirmed she spent time in the hotel lobby, appearing to wait for someone, but staff recalled she eventually left. From that moment, accounts diverged. Some suggested she had arranged to meet another acquaintance. Others claimed she was sighted elsewhere in the city on later nights, but none of those later reports were verified. The Biltmore became the last reliable setting where she was known to be. That gap in time created lasting uncertainty. Between the late hours of January 9th and the discovery of her body on January 15th, 6 full days passed without confirmed sightings. It was in that gap that her fate was determined, but reconstructing it became impossible. People came forward with stories of seeing her at bars or clubs during that time, and each report carried just enough plausibility to distract investigators. But when tested, they could not be tied directly to her. Even the timeline offered by Manley was later scrutinized, though he maintained consistency in statements. Elizabeth Short's name had also appeared in social circles linked to Los Angeles nightlife. One of her noted acquaintances was Mark Hansen, who co-owned the Florentine Gardens nightclub. People who knew both said she stayed with Hansen at times, though not in a romantic sense, despite his interest in her. Witness Ann Toth told detectives that Short had rejected Hansen's advances. Rejections like these, especially during that period, frequently caused tension. Short's life often brought her into the orbit of men who offered assistance but expected something in return. Saying no could leave resentment, particularly among those with influence or resources. Hansen remained a person of interest for years, in part because of the proximity and his inclusion in her circle. The challenge for investigators was untangling how deeply intertwined she had been with these men. Many told detectives they had known her casually, others described fleeting interactions. But in a city already associated with nightclubs, hopeful actresses, and men in powerful positions, the environment itself fueled speculation. That was the same environment the press drew on when constructing her image as the Black Dahlia. For police, however, each relationship had to be examined as potential motive, whether grounded in jealousy, rejection, or exploitation. One clear pattern, across accounts of her social life in Los Angeles, was the imbalance between men in positions of financial security and her own unstable resources. She often relied on others for help, and that created situations where expectations clashed. Rejecting those advances could lead to strained dynamics. Investigators recorded tension in that fact. It made them consider whether an emotional break or anger at being turned away might have played into her ending. But without hard evidence, those questions remained only theories. The reality of her day-to-day living conditions exposed how vulnerable she was in that city. In the 1940s, Los Angeles grew quickly, swelling with returning veterans, new industries, and steady waves of newcomers. Many came seeking opportunities tied to entertainment or war-related work. Among them were young women like Short, who faced high rents, limited employment options, and unstable housing. To survive, many shared crowded rooms, shifted often between rooming houses, and adapted however possible. Within that pattern, it was common to meet strangers, borrow trust, and risk exposure to harm. Elizabeth Short represented that transience. She wrote to her mother and family in Massachusetts, often, usually downplaying her struggles, but the constant movement showed how uneven her grounding was. Rooming houses required payment up front, and when her funds ran low, she shifted. Her reliance on others placed her in precarious positions, sometimes dependent on acquaintances whose kindness could end abruptly. Police saw these details as unavoidable in shaping her path to danger. By the time detectives reconstructed her final movements, her secrecy, her casual connections, and her transient living conditions revealed both a portrait of independence and vulnerability. She had ambitions. She attempted to maintain poise and appearance, but she faced constant struggles under the surface. The last verified sighting at the Biltmore Hotel highlighted that instability most clearly. Who she expected to meet, and whether that meeting occurred, became unanswered questions marking the start of her disappearance. As police closed in on that timeline, every detail seemed to matter. Each recollection of her secrecy from friends, each reference to disputes with acquaintances, shaped how they approached possible suspects. But the absence of solid evidence created doubt at every turn. What her last days revealed was not clarity, but 1,000 fragmented accounts, each slightly different from the last. The reality was that in a city filled with thousands of people moving quickly, 6 days could hold endless possibilities. And the pressure on investigators only increased when autopsy results made the mystery even harder to face. The autopsy of Elizabeth Short, conducted shortly after her body was brought to the Los Angeles County morgue, revealed findings even more disturbing than the discovery of her remains in the field. Dr. Frederick Newbar, the coroner who carried out the examination, faced a task unlike anything seen in the city at the time. His report provided the first official documentation of the extent of her injuries, and it was through his analysis that police learned just how deliberate and skillful the mutilation had been. One of the most striking findings was that Short's body had been completely drained of blood before being abandoned in the lot. It was this absence that explained the pale, wax-like quality of her skin that witnesses had mistaken for a mannequin. For investigators, the detail was chilling because it showed a level of control. Blood loss of that scale could not have happened naturally at the scene. It proved the killing had taken place elsewhere, with time and space for the killer to manage the remains without interruption. The clinical condition of her body was unlike the usual aftermath of violent crime. The clean separation of her torso from her legs confirmed what had been suspected at the crime scene. The autopsy revealed that the division had been executed with precise, straight cuts. Dr. Newbar noted that the dissection followed a medical technique known to surgeons at the time, one rarely seen outside of a hospital or training environment. It was not the work of a hurried or untrained hand. This precision convinced detectives that the suspect might have medical knowledge, leading them to consider doctors, medical students, or lab technicians as potential suspects. The cuts were deliberate, carried out using skill rather than brute force. Equally disturbing was the discovery of mutilation to Short's face. She had been cut from each corner of her mouth outward toward her ears, creating what is now often referred to as a Glasgow smile. The mutilation ensured her death would not only be remembered as violent, but also marked by cruelty. For investigators, this detail carried a weight beyond physical evidence. It suggested her killer wanted to send a message or produce an image designed to horrify anyone who saw her. Paired with the public staging of her body, it presented not only violence but intentional display. Other markings on her body showed evidence of restraint. Autopsy notes recorded deep ligature marks around her wrists and ankles, and additional blunt force trauma was found on her body. These signs indicated that she had been tied during at least part of the ordeal. The abrasions and cuts were consistent with being restrained for a prolonged period, which confirmed to detectives that she had been held alive before her death, rather than killed quickly. The context suggested not just physical domination, but also time spent under the control of her killer. Tests were also conducted to address whether she had been sexually assaulted. While some evidence raised suspicion, the results were inconclusive. That uncertainty left investigators without the ability to confirm one of the most likely motives for why she had been taken. At a time when forensic methods were far less advanced than those available today, the inability to confirm or deny assault limited what police could build into their case. It underscored the gaps in forensic tools during the late 1940s, when questions as vital as motive could remain unanswered. Perhaps the most important medical finding was the determination of her actual cause of death. While the dismemberment was grotesque, Dr. Newbar concluded that it had not killed her. Instead, the clean surgical cutting had been done after her death. Examination showed her fatal injuries were the result of blunt force trauma to the head, coupled with extensive blood loss. Hemorrhaging consistent with a heavy strike overwhelmed her body. It meant she may have remained alive, bound and beaten, before the precise mutilation was carried out following her death. This conclusion clarified that while the staging had shocked the city, the true violence came from an initial lethal blow, combined with blood loss, leading to shock. Understanding the timeline of violence recast the entire case. It shifted focus toward who could not only kill her in such a manner, but then take the time and skill to create a scene afterward. Detectives reviewing Dr. Newbar's findings began building a profile that leaned heavily on the possibility of advanced knowledge. The separation of the body, according to anatomical landmarks, was a clear indicator to them. Many believed that only someone with surgical training, or at least extensive experience in anatomy, could execute such cuts so cleanly. As a result, police quickly reached out for lists of medical students at local universities, particularly the University of Southern California, and began interviewing doctors across the city. These conclusions also fueled the growing frenzy in the press. As details from the autopsy leaked, speculation turned toward the idea of a doctor killer, someone with education and skill using knowledge in a grotesque way. Local papers ran headlines pointing to medical precision, insinuating that the city's own professionals might be capable of secret cruelty. This framing both alarmed and fascinated readers, adding fuel to the already sensationalized coverage. Detectives, in turn, faced heavier pressure to investigate the physicians and interns who once might never have been considered suspects. The autopsy also magnified debate about motive. If the killer had been medically trained, was the dismemberment part of some form of twisted curiosity, or was it simply a practical way of transporting her body? Was the facial cut a sign of revenge, or symbolic violence reflecting more personal intent? These questions outpaced answers. What was clear was that the procedures carried out on her body were not improvised. They were intentional, exact, and implemented with confidence. That confidence, more than any other single detail, defined much of the theory building around the profile of the killer. Despite the clinical conclusions, the report did not bring clarity to the investigation. It added new weight, showing how advanced skill may have been involved, which expanded the suspect pool in ways detectives struggled to manage. While dozens of medical professionals were questioned, no firm suspect was ever pinpointed from that lead. Yet in the court of public opinion, the association of her murder with medical expertise became one of the first lasting narratives tied to the case. By the time forensic examiners signed off on their reports, police knew one fact beyond debate. Whoever murdered Elizabeth Short did not leave behind a random tragedy. The exacting mutilation, the clean division of her body, and the evidence of restraint before her death painted a picture of intent. This was a killer who had taken steps to control every aspect of the crime. While the staging of her body shocked the community, the forensic detail created a new fear. The thought that the person responsible for such calculated violence had knowledge, skill, and potentially a sense of invulnerability. The findings of Dr. Newbar's examination steered the investigation toward one category of suspect above all others: those with specialized training, people who might otherwise never have faced suspicion. The gruesome precision changed the direction of the case, sharpening the suspicion that this was no ordinary killer. But within days of the autopsy, a different and even stranger development occurred. Someone began reaching out directly to the press, as if the killer had just begun speaking. Within a week of Elizabeth Short's body being discovered, newspapers in Los Angeles claimed something startling was happening. The killer, they said, had begun contacting them directly. At a time when the city was still reeling from the brutality of the murder, the idea that whoever had done it was reading news coverage and then responding to it created fear. Authorities already suspected the case would attract countless false tips, but now they faced the unnerving possibility of a killer intent on shaping the story himself. The first sign came through a phone call placed to the Los Angeles Examiner. A man told the newspaper that he was responsible for Elizabeth Short's death. He promised to send in some of her belongings to prove his claim. It was a short call, but clear enough to gain immediate attention. Reporters had already been sensationalizing the murder, yet if the call proved real, their paper would be in direct contact with the person behind the crime. Detectives quickly learned of the call and stood by for confirmation. Within days, something arrived to back up the caller's claim. A package reached the examiner's office with a collection of items that could only have come from Elizabeth Short herself. Among the contents were her birth certificate, photographs, business cards, and personal papers. The most notable possession was a small black address book that contained names and numbers connected to her social circle. For police, the mailing confirmed that the caller had not been bluffing. In addition to the gruesome crime scene, the killer, or someone with direct access to her belongings, was now inserting himself into the investigation. Examiners handling the package noticed something more troubling. Every item had been wiped clean with gasoline. This step, crude but effective, had been used to remove potential fingerprints. The smell was still present. It meant whoever prepared the package understood police procedure. At least, enough to know that forensic testing could link an object to them. While some items still carried partial impressions, they were smudged, and careless handling during the frantic recovery destroyed any usable trace. What could have been the first solid lead dissolved the moment the goods were touched without a forensic plan in place. At a time when crime scene procedure was less advanced and media presence interfered regularly, the error reflected a larger problem facing the LAPD. The address book became a central focus. Investigators studied it closely, finding the name Mark Hansen among the entries. Hansen, the nightclub owner with whom Elizabeth Short had once stayed, would eventually become one of the main figures of suspicion. But the fact that such a personal item had been sent through the mail created troubling questions. Was this truly from the killer, or was it someone hoping to appear involved by mailing the stolen property? Because the book contained both important names and vague contacts, it introduced as many questions as answers. Identity items inside the mailing strengthened the impression that whoever sent it had a direct connection. Police confirmed the belongings were authentic. Yet, despite the potential breakthrough, the gasoline cleaning and mishandling left investigators without physical evidence. They had the taunts of a possible killer, personal property mailed in as a demonstration, and still no actual proof pointing to who had handled any of it. After the package, letters began appearing. Written in a clipped, mocking style, they seemed to refer to the case, and sometimes used cut-out newspaper words pasted onto paper. While the media highlighted them as direct communications from the murderer, detectives quietly doubted their origin. The letters contained little information unknown to the public. Almost everything referenced could have been picked up by reading the press. But because the first package held genuine belongings, it was impossible to dismiss later communications without thorough review. This tension between authentic connection and imitation grew over time. For the press, the letters and package were a new goldmine. Coverage shifted from simply recounting the details of the crime to printing supposed communications from the killer. Headlines announced taunts, challenges, and warnings, each one presented as provocative evidence that the murderer wanted recognition. Readers devoured it. Some believed they were watching a criminal mastermind toy with authorities. Others saw it as a sign that the case was bigger than the LAPD could manage. In living rooms across Los Angeles, people speculated over breakfast about whether the day's paper contained the killer's latest word. Detectives, however, knew the reality was more complicated. False confessions and misleading claims were already overwhelming their resources. The arrival of the package demonstrated at least some level of involvement, yet everything that followed blurred the focus of the case. Sorting genuine leads from attention-seeking noise consumed their time, and as resources spread thin, the certainty of identifying the murderer slipped further away. The gasoline-wiped belongings stood as proof of careful preparation. The letters, on the other hand, may have been pure theatre. Even with those doubts, the chilling effect of the communications could not be overlooked. For the family and friends of Elizabeth Short, seeing her belongings returned through the mail served as a brutal reminder of her vulnerability, now exposed to the public. For the city, it showed a killer, or at least someone claiming to be, who had the confidence to mock police by playing directly with the press. The public display mirrored the crime scene itself. Staged, provocative, and meant to control perception. Behind closed doors, investigators discussed what kind of person would take these steps. Mailing items to a newspaper instead of the police suggested someone who not only cared about attention, but also studied how the press had shaped the story. It was as if the same hand that staged Short's body for discovery now staged her identity in headlines. By inserting himself again and again, the individual responsible elevated the killing into a performance. Whether this truly was the killer, or a fraud, remained unsettled. Detectives admitted the possibility of someone who had access to her belongings without being the murderer. Loaned possessions, theft, or even a contact within her circle could explain how the items changed hands. But the level of detail and the gasoline cleaning gave weight to the claims. Any outsider capable of staging such a mailing had knowledge, and that left open the possibility that Short's killer was someone close enough to her life to handle private items with ease. By the end of January 1947, the investigation was no longer only about finding who killed Elizabeth Short. It was also about determining whether the voice now speaking through phone calls, packages, and anonymous letters belonged to the same person who had mutilated her body. Whoever was responsible had transformed the case into a dialogue between police, press, and public. The moment Short's items arrived in that parcel, the murder became more than an unsolved killing. It became a mystery, haunted by a presence that refused to disappear. As the pressure mounted, detectives were forced to look not just at the communications, but at the names in that address book. and the people who drifted through Elizabeth Short's orbit. It was inside that circle, they reasoned, where the answer might hide. When investigators turned to Elizabeth Short's companions in the days before her death, one man stood out above the rest. His name was Mark Hansen, a nightclub owner whose business connected him with entertainers, musicians, and the regular faces of Hollywood nightlife. Hansen's name appeared in the address book, mailed to the Los Angeles Examiner, one of the belongings sent after Short's murder. For police, that made him someone who could not be ignored. The mailing tied him to her circle. But there was more. A witness offered a personal detail. Short had reportedly rejected Hansen's advances not long before she was killed. That information came from Ann Toth, who had lived in the same home where Short occasionally stayed. According to Toth, Hansen made it clear he was interested in Short, and she turned him down. Rejection in itself was not a crime. But detectives noted how personal tensions often escalated when a man felt brushed aside. Hansen was wealthy, managed a popular Los Angeles club, and drew social power from the people who passed through his doors. He was accustomed to control, both in business and in relationships. Investigators considered whether that sense of control might have turned into resentment toward Short. At the time, Hansen had every reason to be on the radar. His Florentine Gardens nightclub was legendary in Hollywood circles. It was a place where hopeful performers and well-connected men came together, where dancers, waitresses, and musicians mixed with film industry personalities. Hansen himself was deeply tied to that world, giving him both social reach and an air of authority. For someone like Elizabeth Short, who often drifted among acquaintances and relied on others for temporary shelter, Hansen's home represented security. She had lived in his house, off and on, but the relationship never became what he wanted it to be. Police took note of that detail carefully. In questioning, Hansen provided alibis to account for his whereabouts around the time of Short's disappearance. None of his stories contained a direct contradiction investigators could exploit, yet none could fully clear him either. Suspicion hung in the air, but certainty remained absent. Authorities considered keeping him under closer watch, but they lacked enough to hold him. His influence in nightlife, his home hosting Short, and his appearance in the mailed address book all made him stand out. But the absence of direct evidence left him in a frustrating middle ground for investigators. As detectives pressed further into Short's background, they realized how many men had crossed paths with her in the months leading up to her death. The transient way she lived meant she formed new acquaintances quickly, but often without deep or lasting trust. LAPD spent weeks cross-examining dozens of men who had either been romantically interested in her or offered her help at different times. Some described her in glowing terms, others spoke bitterly of conflicts. Yet after each round of questioning, alibis held or stories checked out. The investigation consumed enormous resources without producing a clear suspect. The city itself made the case harder still. Los Angeles was crowded with veterans returning from war, new jobs in aerospace and entertainment, and a restless social culture revolving around cafes and clubs. Short moved through this world seeking stability, but what she often found were men whose expectations soured when she did not return their interest. This pattern gave police reason to consider nearly every man in her orbit a potential threat, broadening the investigation to a degree that slowed progress at every turn. Hansen remained the figure who drew the most attention. The combination of his status, the rejection detail from Toth, and the address book entry kept his name alive in discussions. Yet the frustration for investigators, and for the public following the case in newspapers, was that Hansen never shifted from suspicion to accusation. He lingered as someone who seemed plausible, perhaps even likely, but never definitively tied. Hansen continued running Florentine Gardens even as detectives tried to connect him. He never faced charges, and there was never enough evidence to move a case forward against him. Beyond Hansen, other men from Short's past filled investigative reports, from fellow drifters she had lived alongside in cheap apartments, to servicemen she had courted in letters, to individuals she had met at clubs. Each was interviewed, checked, and then released. Some had complained about her evasiveness when she disappeared to stay with someone else. Others described arguments or moments of tension. Yet one by one, their timelines cleared after closer review. What remained after weeks of questioning was a long list of suspects and no person left standing with credible evidence against them. The futility wore on detectives. The murder had demanded immediate attention, and public pressure was intense, but with no direct witness, no traceable weapon, and no physical evidence linking any one person, each promising lead collapsed under scrutiny. Newspaper stories highlighted the growing list of men questioned, but headlines had no satisfying conclusion when each was cleared. It left the public wondering whether the killer walked among those names anyway, skillfully avoiding detection. For police, it meant frustration. Hansen's case illustrates the difficulty at the heart of the investigation. On paper, he embodied motive and opportunity. He was a man of means. He wanted more from Short than she was willing to give, and he had a direct presence in her life. Yet motive without evidence was speculation, and evidence without proof remained meaningless. Detectives chased rumors tying Hansen more closely to her disappearance, but nothing materialized. He stayed tangled in the case through circumstance, not certainty. By early February of 1947, police had interrogated a wide circle of Short's contacts. They were no closer to an answer than the day her body was found. The list of suspects reflected how precarious her life situation had been, dependent on others, surrounded by acquaintances rather than trusted friends, and vulnerable in ways that left her isolated at the worst possible moment. The investigation showed how easily people around her might have been connected, and how difficult it was to prove responsibility among them. The sense of futility became clear. Each new lead raised interest, only to collapse into another dead end. Detectives faced both the burden of public expectation and the weight of a case that resisted clarity. From Hansen to the long roster of other men, the absence of a direct connection left suspicion floating without anchor. As the weeks slipped away, investigators realized they were losing momentum. Clearing so many potential suspects did not narrow the field in any meaningful way. Instead, it widened again and again as new rumors and false confessions poured in. Without hard evidence, the circle of men questioned came to represent not progress but exhaustion. And out of that exhaustion, detectives faced the problem of wasted time as false leads pulled them even further from the truth. As the shock of Elizabeth Short's murder spread, the case began to attract not only suspects but also people seeking attention. The city was on edge, and every fragment of information about the Black Dahlia drew immense curiosity. It did not take long for opportunists to insert themselves into the story. Some claimed to have seen or heard something, while others went further and confessed outright to killing her. At first, police had to treat each statement seriously, but the more they listened, the clearer it became that many of these confessions were far removed from the truth. Part of what fueled this wave of false leads was a reward. $10,000 was offered for information leading to the capture of Short's killer. In post-war Los Angeles, that sum was a fortune, enough to push both desperate and dishonest individuals to try their chances. Detectives had hoped the money would encourage genuine witnesses to come forward, but instead the announcement turned the case into a magnet for fabrications. Within days, calls and letters poured into the LAPD. Some claimed hidden knowledge of the crime, while others simply walked into police stations and declared themselves guilty. By the time the initial storm had slowed, more than 60 individuals had confessed to the Black Dahlia murder. Men and women, young and old, walked into precincts proclaiming guilt. Nearly every story collapsed under questioning. The problem was not just the number of claims, but how inconsistent they were. Some said they strangled Short, others claimed they stabbed her, and still others insisted they beat her to death. The autopsy had already confirmed the real cause of death, allowing investigators to dismiss most accounts quickly. Yet the sheer volume of confessions forced police to spend valuable time and energy sorting through them. Patterns began to emerge. Many confessions came from those seeking attention, often repeating lurid details taken straight from newspaper coverage. Detectives noticed how these stories mirrored press leaks almost word for word. In other cases, mental illness was a factor. Individuals suffering from delusions arrived convinced they were responsible, even when timelines and evidence proved otherwise. These cases were handled with care rather than anger, but each one drained resources. Every confession required time to record, investigate, and eventually dismiss. Some stood out for their strangeness. One man claimed he killed Short after meeting her in a bar, yet he could not name the bar, describe her clothing, or explain the mutilation. Another said he had attacked her in anger after rejection, but his work records placed him in another state at the time. A woman even told detectives she had taken Short's life because voices compelled her. She, too, was ruled out, but still added to the growing pile of false leads that clogged the investigation. For the LAPD, this chaos was infuriating. Every confession had to be treated as though it could be genuine. Detectives often spent days retracing the steps of claimants before proving they had no connection. This diverted attention from stronger lines of inquiry, such as examining her last known contacts or pursuing forensic leads. In the fragile early weeks of a homicide case, such delays almost certainly damaged the chance of preserving vital evidence. The high-profile nature of the crime only worsened matters. Newspapers had transformed Elizabeth Short into the Black Dahlia, and repeated graphic details that allowed nearly anyone to craft a shallow confession. The more the press sensationalized the case, the easier it became for imposters to imitate pieces of the story. For detectives, this cycle was exhausting. Each hoax had to be documented and dismissed, consuming hours of paperwork, manpower, and public resources. Meanwhile, the city itself was gripped by fear. Women in particular were shaken by the brutality of Short's death and the absence of an identified suspect. Los Angeles nightlife became charged with suspicion. Rumors spread quickly, fueled by headlines suggesting the killer could be a doctor, a stranger from out of town, or someone already within Short's circle. Anxiety deepened further as word spread that supposed killers were walking into police stations to confess. To most residents, there was no way to know these were false. The press heightened the confusion. Headlines rarely distinguished between confirmed facts and invented claims. Some newspapers ran stories about suspects before detectives had even verified their names. Others published interviews with people who later admitted their confessions were lies. Instead of clarifying, the press amplified the disorder. Hoaxes, speculation, and rumor blurred together into background noise that made it increasingly difficult for the public to separate truth from fabrication. This confusion eroded trust between the LAPD and the city. Residents questioned why such a major case seemed to drift in circles. Each confession reported in the news looked like progress. But when the suspect was inevitably cleared, skepticism grew. Detectives complained about press interference, yet the public saw only police failure. The result was mounting tension, citizens demanding answers, detectives buried in false reports, and reporters fueling the cycle for sales. What might have been a vital breakthrough, the reward meant to shake loose hidden facts, turned into a costly distraction. Instead of leading to the killer, it wasted weeks. In homicide investigations, the first days are often the most crucial. Evidence is fresh, witnesses can recall details, and suspects are more easily found. By the time detectives had dismissed the dozens of false claimants, precious time had slipped away. Short's final movements and her true connections had grown colder with every false lead. For investigators, the frustration lay not only in the hoaxes themselves, but in what they represented. The Black Dahlia had grown larger than a single crime. She had become a public figure through relentless coverage, and her murder had turned into a stage where attention seekers and unstable voices sought a role. Instead of bringing clarity, the spotlight blurred the case so deeply that detectives spent more energy untangling lies than pursuing the real killer. By the end of the first wave of false confessions, the LAPD had lost both public trust and valuable investigative time. The reward had failed to uncover a witness with genuine knowledge. Instead, it revealed how powerfully the case had captured imagination and fear. What began as a strategy to catch the murderer had instead shown how difficult it would be to cut through the noise. With the stack of false claims finally pushed aside, detectives made a critical shift. They turned back to the one piece of evidence that could not lie: the autopsy. If the confessions had been a distraction, the physical wounds pointed toward a skill set. Investigators began to consider the possibility that the killer was not just any man, but someone with professional training. Investigators soon realized that the condition of Elizabeth Short's body posed one of the most perplexing questions of the case. Who could have separated a human body with cuts so precise, so clean, that they almost appeared to mirror a textbook surgical procedure? It was not the kind of mutilation that suggested anger or loss of control. Instead, it was systematic. The separation occurred at anatomical points surgeons were trained to use, avoiding jagged tearing or botched angles. This detail alone reshaped the conversation. Detectives began to wonder whether the person responsible had a background in medicine, or at least significant knowledge of anatomy. According to the coroner's official report, the division of Short's torso from her lower half had been carried out with close attention to technique. This was not amateur work. Investigators immediately requested lists of students from the medical school at the University of Southern California. They questioned both current interns and recent graduates, checking hospital rosters and following up with young men who had trained on cadavers. Surgeons from hospitals across Los Angeles were quietly scrutinized as well. Some interviewed directly, others checked through their schedules for signs of absences during the narrow period between January 9th and January 15th. This search reflected a growing belief that the murderer may not have acted alone in brutality but also in skill. Detectives understood that cutting cleanly through pale bone and soft tissue was not something just anyone could accomplish in a matter of hours. Even butchers, who were experienced in carving animal carcasses, might not demonstrate the same exact techniques trained medical professionals used on the human body. That pointed suspicion strongly toward those who had practiced dissection, whether inside a hospital, operating room, or in classes for medical students. Names collected from university records piled up, producing yet another set of suspects to sift through. The theory of a medical man as killer carried a strong cultural force in post-war America. At the time, doctors held both power and distance in the eyes of the public. Families trusted them with birth, illness, and death, sometimes placing life in their hands with total confidence. The idea that such knowledge could be turned away from healing and directed towards sadistic violence was terrifying. Period newspapers, then as now, often amplified that fear. They reminded readers that someone trained to save lives might, under unseen motives, destroy them with a precision few could match. This atmosphere made the suspicion against doctors particularly unsettling. As investigators pressed interviews, they were confronted by one glaring problem. There was nothing physical to connect a doctor or a medical student directly to the crime. Despite the careful cutting, no tools had been recovered, no surgical instruments linked to the murder. There were no bloody coats, no stolen supplies, no missing scalpels that suggested a direct tie. Interviews with medical students often produced firm alibis from classmates, professors, and colleagues. Surgeons at local hospitals pointed to scheduled shifts recorded in hospital logs. Even if the cutting resembled surgery, no piece of hard evidence attached that skill to a single individual. This gap left detectives frustrated. The case files now contained page after page of interviews with young men in training, as well as older professionals, but each lead collapsed when checked. The theory of medical involvement remained persuasive, but it could not be confirmed. It began to drift into the background as authorities shifted attention to other theories. Some within the Los Angeles Police Department considered the possibility of organized crime, suggesting that mutilation might have been a message killing. Los Angeles had a history of racketeering and quiet mob influence, and while the Dahlia murder was unusual in its display, some detectives did not want to ignore the possibility. Others argued the case might not require a skilled surgeon at all. They suggested that a lone killer, studying from anatomy manuals or practicing informally, might achieve something close to a clinical cut. These skeptics argued that the assumption of a doctor was too neat, too easy, and it distracted from broader possibilities. Still, newspapers clung to the idea of medical precision because it heightened the horror and gave an identifiable figure for readers to imagine: the cold physician with secret darkness behind a white coat. Yet the suspicion of medical involvement never completely disappeared. Decades later, the name of George Hodel, a doctor practicing in Los Angeles during the late 1940s, would resurface as one of the most heavily debated suspects. His own son, a former Los Angeles Police Department detective, accused him posthumously of committing the murder, pointing to circumstantial links, such as surgical knowledge, location near where Short was last seen, and even private conversations caught on surveillance years afterward. While none of this evidence proved guilt to the satisfaction of modern authorities, the very fact that a doctor remained embedded in the list of leading suspects showed how strongly that theory lingered. George Hodel's case captured attention partly because it combined the elements detectives had long suspected: professional training, social connection to Los Angeles elites, and a reputation clouded by scandal. Whether or not he truly killed Elizabeth Short, his name became tied to her story. Historians and authors repeatedly returned to him, recycling the original suspicion that someone with medical expertise had carried out the crime. To them, Hodel represented the long shadow cast by that one conclusion: the cuts had been too precise for chance. Through the years, other lines of theory grew, linking Short's death to lone killers, drifters, or opportunistic predators taking advantage of her vulnerable lifestyle. But competing with those theories was always the image of the doctor killer. It survived not because investigators ever proved it, but because the facts of the autopsy never lost their force. Even for those who believed organized crime or a wandering murderer was responsible, the surgical approach to her dismemberment demanded explanation. That is why, long after the Los Angeles Police Department finally set the case aside, the suspicion of a medically trained hand continued to haunt the story. Though every doctor investigated at the time was cleared of wrongdoing, taking the suspicion off professionals never fully convinced the public. The uncanny neatness of the cuts just seemed too exacting, too informed to dismiss entirely. It created a tension between fact and possibility, what the investigation could prove and what people continued to believe. In the end, the theory of medical involvement joined the long list of unanswered possibilities. It shaped nearly every stage of discussion, influenced the suspect lists, and gave the case one of its most enduring myths: that behind the Black Dahlia stood not only cruelty, but skill. With no guilty party identified, the suspicion of a doctor or student became part of the unsolved legend itself. And so, while Elizabeth Short's death never produced a trial or conviction, it produced an enduring question: had a trained professional carried out one of the most shocking murders in city history? That question has lingered across generations, surviving in books, whispered theories, and cultural memory. By the time investigators shifted their focus elsewhere, the answer had already slipped beyond proof. Without resolution, the murder of the Black Dahlia passed quietly into the territory of legend, where it has remained ever since. By 1950, the Black Dahlia investigation had slowed to a crawl. What began in 1947 as one of the most publicized murder cases in Los Angeles history had collapsed into unsolved frustration. 3 years earlier, crowds had gathered at the crime scene, newspapers had filled front pages with speculation, and the Los Angeles Police Department had thrown every available detective onto the case. Yet despite the intensity, and despite the resources spent chasing tips, no charges ever stuck. For detectives assigned to the case, the absence of closure became heavier with each passing year. During the first wave of inquiries, police had interrogated an extraordinary range of suspects. By official count, hundreds of individuals were questioned. Names came from her address book, from her circle of acquaintances, from men who had passed through her life briefly, and even from anonymous tips phoned into police stations. Thousands of leads poured in. Some were built on rumors from barrooms, others from innocent chance encounters. By the first anniversary of her death, law enforcement had investigated every tip that promised significance. Not one had produced the evidence needed. The case file grew larger, but clarity never emerged. The lack of progress did not sit well with the public. The brutality of the crime demanded action, and newspapers had created an expectation that a shocking case would produce shocking revelations. Instead, as weeks turned into months, the public began to view the investigation as ineffective. To restore some confidence, a grand jury review was called. This review examined how the case had been handled, whether leads were properly managed, and whether the police had been disciplined in approach. It was a measure of just how much pressure authorities faced at the time. Detective Harry Hansen, one of the lead investigators, reaffirmed his belief that medical expertise played a role. His testimony suggested the department had not ruled out the theory that someone with surgical training had committed the crime. This was consistent with findings at the autopsy. But the grand jury did not bring police closer to identifying a specific suspect. Hansen's words reflected the lingering suspicion that the killer had unusual knowledge. But suspicion alone did not satisfy the public hunger for resolution. The hearing underlined how little progress had been made. Out of the pressure grew something unexpected. The failure to close the Black Dahlia case contributed to new laws in California. One measure required sex offender registries, a response to public fear and frustration. Politicians pushed for more oversight of crimes with sexual elements, believing that organized records might prevent future brutality. The fact that Elizabeth Short's murder helped shape policy showed its cultural weight, even in the absence of justice. The memory of her death influenced the way California tracked offenders for decades afterward. The case had also exposed a weakness within the department itself. From the beginning, the Los Angeles Police Department had struggled with how the press shaped the story. Media outlets regularly published details before investigations could confirm them. Arrests and false confessions often appeared in headlines before detectives had sorted fact from invention. By the time police issued clarifications, readers had already accepted distorted versions. This imbalance cast the department as reactive, unable to steer the narrative while reporters dictated the public understanding of events. Some within the Los Angeles Police Department admitted the issue openly. Sergeant Finis Brown, involved at the time, criticized how newspapers worsened their efforts. Information was printed faster than police could react, and secrecy in building the case was undermined. Detectives found themselves questioned not only by superiors, but by journalists asking for explanations about theories never meant for the public. This dependence on controlling the narrative became as draining as the actual legwork of interviewing witnesses and checking alibis. While the crime itself shocked the public, the secondary story was how the police seemed tangled in the media's grip. As the years passed, enthusiasm for the case eroded inside the department. Resources waned. Detectives assigned in the early months rotated to newer responsibilities. Fresh cases that demanded attention immediately. Murders with clear suspects needed quick resolution, while the Dahlia file sat unsolved, still consuming hours without producing results. The lack of fresh leads discouraged allocation of manpower. By the late 1940s, the commanding officers began funneling investigators away, acknowledging privately that chasing breakthroughs in the Black Dahlia murder was increasingly less realistic. The cultural moment had shifted too. Other crimes, rising waves of organized crime investigations, and political corruption scandals competed for public attention. The sensationalism of the Black Dahlia began to fade from daily headlines, even as her memory lingered in whispers and occasional anniversary articles. Each time the case resurfaced, attention rekindled briefly, only to disappear again when no new evidence surfaced. To detectives, that cycle captured their frustration. They knew public outrage would return, but they also knew there was little more they could offer. By early 1950, the pace of investigation had slowed so much that cold case became a fitting description. Leads were rare. The few tips that arrived came from distant locations, long after Short's death. The chances of finding new witnesses diminished with time. Memories faded, people moved, stories shifted. Physical evidence, already scarce, offered no breakthroughs. The files that remained were records of failed leads, incomplete confessions, and suspects who had all been cleared. The case file, once active and piled daily with new papers, was now static. Yet while the investigation itself cooled, the cultural shadow of the case did not. In Hollywood, books began to reference Short's murder. Screenwriters shaped fictionalized stories influenced by the Dahlia. Crime magazines continued publishing articles speculating about the killer's identity. Even if the police had laid the case down, storytellers continued to pick it up. That was how the Black Dahlia transformed from a single unsolved murder into an enduring piece of American crime folklore. Detectives accepted that official closure might never come. Evidence had not been preserved in ways modern cases demanded, and each year the chance to link the crime to someone real diminished further. Still, talk of the Dahlia seeped through police stations. On anniversaries, younger officers sometimes asked veterans about the case. For the Los Angeles Police Department, the Dahlia represented both an unsolved nightmare and an ongoing reminder of institutional error. The failure to control evidence, to protect the investigation from media distortion, and to close the case haunted their reputation long after public anger calmed. By the early 1950s, the answer was clear enough inside the department. The Black Dahlia file was no longer active. It had settled into permanent cold case territory, surviving only in memory, stored paperwork, and occasional reviews when public interest flared. Elizabeth Short remained without justice. Her killer remained unknown, and Los Angeles carried the burden of one of its most infamous, unsolved crimes. While the case had ended formally as an investigation, its influence did not fade. Instead, it grew into legend. The unanswered questions invited speculation, preserving the story through novels, films, and whispers across the city. The unsolved nature became the very feature that kept it alive. Even as officers closed the active file in the station, the surrounding world opened it wider, keeping Elizabeth Short's murder alive for decades in ways police never anticipated. Decades later, one question still follows the story of Elizabeth Short. Who killed her? 70 years have passed since that cold morning in Los Angeles, yet the mystery remains frozen in time. Unlike other cases where the trail goes cold and stays that way, the Black Dahlia has lived on, not only in police files but in endless theories about the killer's identity. What makes the case unique is not just the crime itself, but how people have continued to revisit it. Each generation finds reasons to keep asking if the truth might still be uncovered. One of the earliest and most obvious suspects remained Mark Hansen, the wealthy nightclub owner. His connection to Short was based on her brief stays in his home, his name in her belongings, and the story that he wanted more from her than she was willing to give. Hansen maintained alibis and was never charged, but he lingered in public suspicion. The idea of a powerful man, rejected and humiliated, seemed plausible motives for some. Yet without direct evidence, Hansen went on with his life, while questions about his possible involvement remained etched into the background of the investigation. The list of suspects grew wider as years passed. Organized crime became another theory. Rumors floated that Short may have crossed paths with men tied loosely to gambling or racketeering operations in Los Angeles. These theories pointed to her vulnerable social standing, her tendency to rely on acquaintances, and the risk of trusting people she barely knew. Some thought her death might have been staged as a terrifying symbol, a warning embedded in the careful positioning of her body. But again, no trail led police closer to organized groups. The idea stayed alive as cultural rumor more than fact. The most persistent theory to survive came decades later, tied to a man named George Hodel. Hodel was a physician in Los Angeles at the time of the Dahlia murder, known not just for his medical career but for his controversial personal life. His name re-emerged in the late 1990s when his son, Steve Hodel, a retired Los Angeles Police Department detective, began publicly stating he believed his father had committed the murder. Steve presented a combination of circumstantial evidence that he argued pointed directly to George. Among those claims were alleged photographs that appeared to depict Elizabeth Short, though experts have disagreed over whether the woman in the images was her. Steve also cited comments recorded during a later police surveillance of Hodel's home, where his father made cryptic remarks about killings and police investigations. To Steve, these were informal confessions. He tied those remarks back to the Black Dahlia, suggesting his father had both the medical knowledge and the proximity to carry the crime out. Another piece offered by Steve involved cement sacks found near the lot where Short's body was discovered. Witnesses in 1947 recalled empty bags at the site, and decades later, Steve argued those bags matched the kind George Hodel used for home renovations. It was not physical proof, but in his view, it added one more thread linking his father to the scene. This web of circumstantial details has convinced some readers and drawn widespread interest in books and media projects built on Steve's claims, but official investigators have never accepted those conclusions. Both the Los Angeles Police Department and historians studying the case remain skeptical. None of the evidence presented constitutes direct proof. The photographs have been debated, with experts split on whether they picture Short at all. The taped remarks, while strange, are not a clear admission, and cement bags, a common enough item, lacked any physical identification tying them to George Hodel specifically. For law enforcement, Steve's theory is compelling in narrative, but not definitive in a courtroom. Skeptics have also pointed out the risk of personal bias, noting that Steve was motivated by a complicated family history. That skepticism has not dampened public fascination. George Hodel's name became almost interchangeable with the Black Dahlia in modern discussions. Books, documentaries, and even dramatized series have returned again and again to the debate about whether he was the true killer. Each new telling pushes his name further into cultural recognition, even when police stand firm that the evidence is inconclusive. The fascination is less about certainty and more about the possibility. People are drawn to the idea of a hidden killer living among Los Angeles' elite, someone connected to medicine and art who carried darkness in private. Outside of courtroom-level suspicion, the story of the Black Dahlia has transformed into cultural folklore in Hollywood. Her image is linked to the city's darker side, appearing in novels, films, and crime histories that focus on glamour and brutality side by side. She has become part of the same mythology that surrounds other legendary Los Angeles stories, where fame and violence mix and leave questions without answers. Much like the cases of Jack the Ripper in London or the Zodiac Killer in California, the lack of closure is what ensures survival. The mystery endures because it was never solved, because speculation is the oxygen that keeps it alive. The contrast between Short's actual life and the life imagined by the public widened further over the decades. In reality, she was a 22-year-old who had moved constantly, mostly between boarding houses and temporary jobs. But the Black Dahlia mythology painted her as a dark starlet drawn into the underbelly of Los Angeles. In that way, myths about her life became as famous as her death. The press created the first distortions in 1947, and over time, books and films repeated them until they took on a life of their own. In the end, even those who study the case often see Elizabeth Short less as a person and more as a symbol of Hollywood's most haunting unsolved crime. The tension between truth and story is what makes the mystery so difficult to untangle. Were Hansen, Hodel, or another man the real killer? Was organized crime involved, or was it the isolated act of a lone predator? We cannot know. What remains is a collection of circumstantial theories, none strong enough to carry a conviction. What does exist is the enduring image of the Black Dahlia herself, part victim, part legend, written into Los Angeles as both a caution and a fascination. And so the Black Dahlia remains unmatched as both an investigation and a story. The facts may sit still in police archives, but the narrative moves restlessly through culture, adapting with each new generation that studies her death. It is this dual identity, unsolved crime and cultural tale, that ensures the case may never truly end. The records may tell us the investigation is closed, but the story will never be. If the truth were ever uncovered today, it would change more than a closed case file. It would alter a legend that stretched for decades, one that shaped how Los Angeles saw itself and how the world saw Los Angeles. The question of what that truth might mean remains just as open as the case itself.